So we are looking at the next process. And our next process, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the development of the nation state in the age of nation states, right? We're going to talk about the domestic developments. We've talked about the use of diplomacy by Cavour to unite Italy, the use of diplomacy and realpolitik by Bismarck to unite Germany. We saw the failure of diplomacy in the Second French Empire. And now we're kind of migrating towards the development of the domestic state. So let's go and jump in. We're going to start with Russia. Russia coming through the ashes of the Crimean War, which we've already talked a great deal about. The Crimean War caused over 450,000 deaths, casualties, injuries, terrible moment. We know that Nicholas I, as a reactionary, he acted out of anger and revenge. So instead of realizing that there was no possibility of winning this war, he utilized his resources to continue to fight this war. This only comes to an end when he died, and his death served as a turning point as Alexander II quickly helped bring an end to this war. And by 1856, with the Peace of Paris, Russia is now basically at a ground level, and Alexander II is thinking, what can I do to lead to progress? And he drew a conclusion that the reason they were so bad off was serfdom. So he sends out some instructions to the nobility and says, hey, what can we do to get rid of serfdom? And he waited for the nobles. 57, 58, 59. Are the nobles going to get back to him? Of course not. The serfdom was their livelihood. So he's going to have to take reforms into his own hand. And this is where we see Alexander II as the great reformer. I do want to make sure you understand that this is not something I'm identifying. I see his reforms as all faux reforms, fake reforms. They're all meant to justify his absolute rule. And his reforms really lead to nothing. But let's jump in. Number one, the Emancipation Edict of 1861. This was welcomed by a small group of Russian liberals. They really believed that this was the moment modernization is about to start. They're ready to walk into that modernity. Is this the moment that they were hoping for in 1825 that got crushed? They celebrated it. But let's not get too excited. Almost immediately, we realized this isn't going to do what they wanted to do. First, yes, technically the serfs are now free peasants. But as free peasants, before they can leave their land, they owed an indemnity to the noble. So now the peasants have to pay for the lost labor for the noble. So how much money do you think the peasants have? Yeah, of course, they don't have anything. They're poor. They have nothing. So how are they going to pay this? Well, they're not. And so therefore, in 1861, with the end of serfdom, we don't get urbanization. We don't get industrialization. We don't get modernity. And the peasants were given the poorest land to try to make a living, and yet they're not going to. And probably the worst thing that occurred here is the mer, or the town, the village council. It was once a beacon of hope and justice. When the serfs were in desperate need for things, they would go to the mer for help. Well, this edict turned the mirror from being hope and justice to the tax collector. They're the ones that collect the indemnity. So instead of community being bound by the mer, they become divided. So this actually does worse. In some ways, the new free peasants are worse off than they were as serfs to a degree. So you can look this up. You can do some research if you want to. But clearly, this was not the revolutionary change. And if you don't believe me, I love this image. This is an image of the Russian peasants. As we're looking at this is in 1889. This is labor-intensive farming. This is no different than the farming they did 200, 300, or 400 years earlier. Think about it. In the 1700s, Great Britain was leading the agricultural revolution with the mechanization, with the seed drill, the reaper, so much more. They were creating progress. And yet in 1889, Russia has tasted none of that. So the result of the immediate, it's not about solving a problem. It creates the foundation for future revolutions. The peasants are going to learn a hard lesson here. They are bound to the czar, and that czar is going to be a little different. I want to see how that plays out. All right. With that said, Alexander's other reforms. He created this group, this Zemstvos. Here's an image of what the Zemstvos were. Zemstvos were town or county governments that were popularly elected. The liberals were hoping that this was going to be a great political reform that ultimately led to a legislature. Each of the Zemstvos, which again were each in these towns, they were elected. There were three different groups: the nobility, the peasants, and the townspeople. And the hope was, this is where Alexander II, he clearly didn't understand reality. He was hoping that the Zemstvos would trickle up democratic reform. Because Alexander II was not in a position of strength against the nobility, so he could not create any systemic changes. So he's hoping that the Zemstvos would lead the way. So again, Alexander II, as this reformer, really a weak leader. Maybe the most long-lasting things were the legal reforms. You have the independent courts, which were no longer dominated by the nobles. So the nobles were now responsible. They couldn't go out and kill peasants. They would be held accountable for murder. There's a sense of equality before the law. So I just want to point out that these reforms are very limited. There's not a sense of reality to these. They are faux reforms who are meant to appease the liberals, appease the intelligentsia, to appease the peasants. But in the end, Russia in 1880 is no different than it was in reality than it was 300 years earlier. They have some ornaments that might look cute, but the reality is no different. This talks about, where McKay talks about two waves of industrialization. This is the first wave. There was a focus on heavy industry. Some industrial suburbs did develop throughout St. Petersburg and Moscow, but these urban slums were much worse than even those in England. The industrial development increased national wealth, but did not see an age of progress as the Western Europeans witnessed. Really very important that you understand that concept. And I love this per capita wages. These are real wages. And look at this. Look at where Boston is. Boston's off the chart. Manchester, not bad. But Moscow and St. Petersburg is really no different than Egypt or Bombay. Bombay and Egypt were colonies of England for the most part. So Russia was no better off than colonies. So this is really going to disrupt these reforms, and it's going to lead us to radicalism. And this growth of radicalism is really important, because what we see is the aggrandizement. So during all this time period, Alexander II is overseeing really a vast increase in size. But as they're growing larger, he is actually suppressing them. So in one side, he's promising reforms, but Alexander II is absolutely oppressing things like free speech. He's oppressing the Poles, the Muslims, and the Mongolians. He's attempting to secure stability. And with no legislative body, the intelligentsia did not develop any political experience or unity. Intelligentsia, these are the intellectual elites that typically the government relies on for policy. They're the ones that help set a paradigm. And the intelligentsia, they're not going to have any concept of unity, experience, and that's really going to lead to a hopelessness. And through that hopelessness, the intelligentsia at local levels will embrace a wide variety of radical thoughts, from anarchism to violent anarchism. Marxism is, again, a really weird thing that's developing in this time period, because they're not post-industrial. But anarchism, the belief that if you destroy the government, kill a czar, that the autocracy would collapse and you can empower the localities. And that's going to lead us right to the People's Will. The People's Will in 1881 was a very small terrorist organization. They were anarchists, and they believed only through the assassination of leaders could they achieve a revolution. And in 1881, they absolutely blew up Alexander II. There was no recovering from this explosion. And in 1881, the People's Will was hoping that through the death of Alexander II, a revolution would occur. So now what we kind of see this polarization. The Tsar, who is really not in touch with the Russian people. The Russian people are not sure how to lead. There's no intelligentsia leading the way. There's no legislative body. There's no ideas. There's no unity. There's no real sense of national organization for these groups. And in the end, the assassination. This is where we're going to pause. I hope that makes sense.